All right, it's 3:01. We only have an hour today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for the launch of Move the Money. My name is Catherine Foley, and I'm with the Building Movement Project. We have a lot of folks who wanted to join today, so we're going to get started. We're really excited to share these resources with you, and we want to thank you again for joining us. Today we'll be launching Move the Money, Practices and Values for Funding Social Movements. Before we get started, I just want to share some tech logistics. So as you probably know, attendees are not visible. You can use the chat to send any questions or concerns to BMP admin, which is my colleague, Kitty Hu. This webinar is also being recorded and we'll share out the recording along with any additional materials. We have auto transcriptions and captions available. So if you're watching this on your computer, you can turn on the captions at the bottom of your screen. And finally, if you're on Twitter, please tweet along, use the hashtag #MoveTheMoney, and you can tag us at BLDING movement. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to BMP's co-director, Sean Thomas Breitfeld.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and welcome everybody. We're so happy that you are here for the launch of Move the Money. We're really excited about the resources that we've been working on developing, and really honored to have the opportunity to have a conversation with both Kris, Hayashi, Executive Director of the Transgender Law Center, and Crystal Hayling, Executive Director of the Libra Foundation, who were interviewed for this project and who you'll see in videos, but we also wanted to have a conversation with them about what it really takes to equip philanthropy to really support movements and organizations that are building movements across the country. Also, we're going to be joined by my colleague Deep Iyer, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Building Movement Project and really spearheaded this whole project on Move the Money. And so Deep is going to be able to walk us through all of the resource and what's on the website so that you can get an orientation to the rich set of resources that we've prepared. We wanted to start actually by getting a sense of who has joined us. And so want to get this poll going. And so trying to just get a quick sense of, how many folks are grant makers, grant seekers, or in some other role. So you should be seeing a poll. All right, and so here we can see the results. It looks like, pretty evenly split between grant seekers and folks identified as being in some other role. And then around 24% of folks on the call right now are grant makers. So really excited to have all of you with us. Thanks so much. Just so that you have a little bit of sort of context about Building Movement Project. We're a national organization focused on research and developing resources that can support and also push the nonprofit sector to be more focused on social change and social justice. And we really see that this work around movement building and supporting, but also providing resources to help move the money to movements is really a part of the focus that BMP has had for the last 20 years. And so I want to invite my colleague Deepa to talk a little bit more about Move the Money and what we have, what we've built out for folks. Sorry, maybe I'll just finish with the overview of the webinar goals. So Deepa's going to provide an overview and introduction to Move the Money so that you all can see what's on the website, get orientation to the materials. As I said, we're joined by both Kris Hayashi and Crystal Hayling, and we're going to have a dialogue with them to talk about some of the issues that get raised by the videos, and so that you can hear their own views and experiences. And really, again, the whole focus of the section of the website, the materials, is to really support and, to some extent also push philanthropy by equipping them with tools to really support and move money to movement building efforts in movement building organizations. Deepa, can you give folks a orientation to all of the materials that
Yes.
taking the lead on creating?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean, and welcome everyone. We're really glad that you're here. So let me get started to give you an overview of what we are launching today. So Move the Money is a series of tools that's really geared towards enabling long-term and meaningful investments in social movements that are at the front lines of building collective power and changing systems. These resources that we're launching today provide ideas, examples, and action steps for why it's really critical to support social movements by investing in leaders and in infrastructure and in ecosystems, and how to do so through practices that are values aligned, effective, and responsive. So when we envisioned these resources, we wanted to make sure that they were not just ideas based, but also practical and usable, regardless of whether you're at the beginning of supporting social movements and need to make a case for it internally, or whether you're much further along and need to deepen your investments. And we wanted to understand what would happen in terms of the efficacy and sustainability of social movements if philanthropy has a genuine relationship with movement leaders and movement organizations. So to that end, Move the Money is being launched today in both video and print formats. It includes 4 thematic videos that are based on dialogues that we conducted between movement leaders and funders. And it includes 4 guides that you can use, which have reflection questions, case studies, examples, and recommendations. So who is Move the Money for? Well, we hope that these resources are going to be used by a range of partners, by community, family, corporate foundations that are recognizing the importance of centering equity and justice, by larger foundations that want to resource POC-led groups more effectively, to intermediaries that are advising philanthropy. We also hope that movement leaders can use these resources to better advocate with their own funders to expand support by investing in their sustainability. We're deeply aware as we release these materials that there is an urgency to this time. With the pandemic, the political environment, the push for racial justice, we recognize that more and more people are mobilizing around the opportunities for systemic change, and that social movements can catalyze that energy and power if they receive the support that they require. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have been engaging for some time now with our partners and stakeholders in a variety of ways to build out Move the Money. We organized learning sessions to understand the characteristics of social movements. We curated a movement leadership learning lab in which funder participants did a deeper dive into understanding the core needs of movement leaders who were addressing the overlapping crises of 2020. And we conducted interviews where we paired a movement leader and a funder for candid dialogue. You'll see the faces of the leaders we interviewed in this slide and at the top of our web portal, which we'll share with you now. So as we move to the Move the Money web portal, what I want to really underline here is that it's really important to note that the resources that we've developed draw upon, build upon, and contribute to the wave of ongoing efforts that are advocating for the importance of supporting social movements through effective and values-aligned philanthropic practices, including decolonized philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy, and many others. So thank you so much, Catherine, for taking us to the web portal for Move the Money. Here you will find a 4-step process for engaging with the content. So we invite you to first start with the user guide, where you'll understand the goals, values, and process that we embarked on in developing this project and who we did it in partnership with. Then we invite you to watch the 4 thematic videos to deepen your understanding, and then read and reflect with the brief guides that accompanies these videos. By then, you should be ready to move the money. And on the right-hand side at the top, you'll see various ways in which you could do that. We invite you to contact us if you'd like to facilitate a workshop with your staff. You could curate your own discussion to guide strategic planning or evaluate philanthropic practices. And we encourage you to stay in touch with us so that you can learn about the deeper dives into this content we'll be putting out throughout the course of this year, as well as the seminar series we'll be curating in early 2022. This is a long-term project for us. So with that, I want to actually take us to the middle of this portal where you can see the videos themselves. As you can see, we've got 4 videos here in the boxes, and each of them addresses a different theme. Why are social change movements important? Enables us to understand from the perspectives of movement leaders what the characteristics of movements are and how they build power. What is the role of philanthropy in supporting social change movements? Allows us to understand how to reshuffle power dynamics and change the culture of philanthropy. And then we also will hear about movement leadership itself. What do movement leaders need from philanthropy? And how can philanthropy support them? Are the next 2 videos. We'll take a moment to look at one of the guides so you can get a sense of what the guide itself looks like when you download it in this box. So this particular guide is on what do movement leaders need from philanthropy. It accompanies that video. You'll see here that we've envisioned this as a chair with 4 legs that talks about the 4 needs of movement leaders. And that includes, as you go through, some recommendations on how to build skills building, how to develop squads of support, how to nurture spaces of strategy, and then, of course, how to invest in sustainability. There are reflection questions throughout these guides, and at the end, there are also places where you can take notes and add your own observations as well. So again, print and video, usable content that we hope you can utilize by yourself or in conjunction with us. So with that, I want to also encourage you to ask us questions if you have any in the chat. We have put a link into the chat where you can find the web portal. We would love it if you could reach out and on Twitter or on social media using #MoveTheMoney, let folks know about these resources and that they're available. And finally, at the bottom of this web page portal, you will find the acknowledgements, which I think are very important. We're grateful to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for supporting the lab and the series. And we're also grateful to the participants of the Movement Leadership Learning Lab, as well as the movement leaders and funders who engaged in the dialogues that undergird these videos, and their names are located here. I also want to acknowledge and thank the range of folks who were responsible for this project. Cecilia Sweetcall, Amy Paul, Sean and Francis, of course, our co-directors, and Kitty Hugh and Catherine Foley. This project could not have happened without their support and commitment. So with that, we're going to actually move into our round of discussion. What we're going to do is show you a video, and then we're going to have a facilitated discussion that Sean will moderate with Kris, Hayashi, and Crystal Hayling, who again were interviewed for this series, about their reflections on a couple of the topics and themes in Move the Money. So we're going to go ahead and show the video titled, "What Do Movement Leaders Need from Philanthropy?" In case you cannot access the sound, we have put the link into the chat, and the videos are also subtitled. Go ahead, Catherine. Thank you.
Straight up general dollars, general support dollars, experimentation dollars, seed dollars, innovation dollars, not worrying about being able to pay your folks family sustaining, fair, equal wage, and making sure that you can carry out the work. If folks want to be a part of our movement, if they can't meet their basic needs, then how are we supposed to win at social justice and social justice movement?
Look at what are the needs of the people who are actually doing the work and leading the work, and how they can be personally supported is really important, because there's just still this thought process that if you are in movement work, you are doing it out of the love and you don't need any money to do it.
The most important thing for me has been time to conspire, to strategize, to think with people outside of like this everyday bubble that care about the issue, that have their own level of expertise, that know the players in a different way, to help me think about how we move forward.
You think about a career is 40 to 50 years long. In this work, a 5 to 10 year spans of time can be a 40 to 50 year burden on a person's body, mind, and soul. And so how are we thinking about allowing people to breathe and building that in?
What ends up happening is that, at least for me as a leader, I end up spending so much more time on the administrative side, filling out the applications, writing the reports, finding the accountants, and all the things that I hate. What I love to do and what I'm actually really good at with the strategy, the visioning, the organizing, I'm doing less and less of that. More and more, I'm being taken away from the actual mission of doing on the groundwork.
We also need grants that go into the infrastructure development, really. I think we need more funders who are willing to give you grants to be like, you know what, it's okay if you don't do programming this year. But if you are gonna take a year and pause, and you're gonna build out your structure of the organization, that would be such a weight off, because I think sometimes we worry that if we don't produce the programmatic work, we reached X people, we built out 10 leaders, we did this, and the grantor is like, well, what did you actually do?
After year one, so where's this coalition that you talked about? Where's this platform that you are hoping to do? Okay, you all will get there at the speed that you will get there. Just trust in leadership without strings attached. That is what is ultimately needed if we really want to see the type of change that our communities deserve.
Philanthropy needs to be aware of an ecosystem, and I think this is true in every community. It's a way of strengthening the collective leadership, and that's what movements produce.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to invite both Kris and Crystal to join me on screen so we can continue this conversation. That was a video highlighting some of what the movement leaders who were interviewed as a part of the dialogues had to say about what their needs were. And obviously lots packed in those few minutes. But Kris, I want to start with you because one of the things that Charles Long said from the Movement for Black Lives was how we've got a 5 to 10 year span of work that someone might be doing, but it's in a movement context, which ends up feeling like 40 years, right? And so, in terms of the toll on people's body, mind, soul, all of that. And I'm curious, how do you sustain yourself in this critical work? And what role do you see funders playing to reduce some of the burden that ends up being put on leaders of movement building organizations and movement support organizations?
So thank you so much for that question. And it's really great to be here with everyone today. So, before coming to the Transgender Law Center, I had spent nearly 20 years in local grassroots movement building organizations, majority of them all led by Black and brown folks. And by the time I got to TLC, I was so burned out. I see pictures of myself in that time, and it honestly makes me sad. But one of the things that made the biggest difference was arriving at TLC, which at the time, and we're a very different organization now than then, but at the time was a white-led national organization. And I want to be clear that while that was true, as a trans organization, had nowhere near the resources that the organization needed or deserved, but had more resources than I had ever seen in my 20 years of movement building work. And I was making more money than I had ever made. And I say this as a person with, a good number of privileges, that shift in my personal economic reality and in the economic reality of the organization in which I was housed was huge to my sustainability. So to the question, what can funders do to reduce this burden for movement leaders? If we want thriving and powerful movements, we need to resource organizations, particularly those led by some of the most impacted communities. We want the people in them to not just survive, but to truly thrive. We need to resource organizations like we truly want us to be able to model the world that we're all striving for and building towards, where all of us and our families have food, have housing, have healthcare, have time for joy and rest. And I want to give some concrete examples. So I know this is true from my own personal experiences, but also from some of what we've been able to do at TLC over the past year in particular. So TLC is a majority trans organization. We're a majority Black, Indigenous, and people of color organization. We have folks on staff who are migrants, who are living with HIV, who are living with disabilities all over the country. So during 2020, for all of what 2020 was, our folks were deeply impacted. So we created a range of policies and practices to try and meet this moment of a collective crisis. And I will say what was a game changer for us is that we were so fortunate. We were one of the recipients of the Mackenzie Scott grants. So some of the things that we were able to do, not all, but some of them were made possible by that. We were able to do things like pay for Black and brown trans therapists and healers to come in and work with our staff. We were able to do things like purchase PPE and other supplies for staff and community members and make sure that our folks got those. We were able to do things like, before the many crises we faced last year and continue to face, like the shelters in place, the curfews, all of those things, we were able to give stipends to our staff and some community members so people could buy food, could get emergency supplies together. We were able to do those types of things to support our team and our community. So to the question of what funders can do to really support the sustainability of movement leaders, it's to move resources that are unrestricted, that are multi-year, that are substantial. And if the way that you're able to do that is to create like a very specific fund that's about like movement leader sustainability or preventing burnout, absolutely do that. But let movement leaders define what that sustainability looks like.
Thanks so much, Kris. And so Crystal, the Libra Foundation has made a commitment to moving resources to Black-led organizations in particular. And so can you talk a little about how the moving of the money, the increasing of those investments has been both received, but also what sort of impact you're seeing in terms of the movement leaders that you're connected to and supporting? And if you have thoughts about what your peers in philanthropy should be doing more of, feel free to weigh in on that as well.
Thank you so much, Sean. And it's an honor to have been invited to join this conversation and be here in conversation with Kris, whose work I respect so much. And I just, I think when we talk about what it is that we need to do to fund movement work, these videos and what you've done are so helpful. And what Kris just outlined is so clear about what folks need. And we come to this kernel and this core issue about general operating support dollars, about long-term funding, right? So that it's not about let's fund outcomes. Ultimately, what we are doing is building relationships with people. And I think that for many funders starting out, the idea that we're funding organizing, that we're funding movement building is still a little bit mysterious. We recently had a conversation with Alicia Garza, who's written a fantastic book, Purpose of Power. And she talks about the fact that organizing is not about finding your tribe, it's about growing your tribe. And I love that because it really is about that constant growth of meeting people where they are, finding the common ground, and then continuing to find ways to bring them into the circles of work that we're doing, right? That is not just about what is highly transactional, which is like voter turnout. It is actually the transformational work of building community. And for organizations to be able to do that, it's very difficult for them to say, this is the outcome that is going to unlock that. There is no magic bullet, right? It is a constant growing and moving. And what I think Kris really also points out is that work requires a whole constellation of activities. It's healing, it's resisting, it's creating, it's dreaming, it's networking, it's organizing, it's policy development. And all of those things need to be happening at the same time. So if we are wanting organizations to be able to build the infrastructure to do that, to be creative and generative, then as funders, we have to be willing to give them the resources to do it. And let me just speak for a second about what that requires within foundations, because we don't talk, I don't think, enough in foundation world about what that requires. It means that we actually have to do our work differently. The idea of what a program officer is one that kind of gets set in stone, and we haven't really unpacked that in a long time, right? You know, so that program officer's job is to review proposals. How about if it's not? How about if a program officer's job is to be in relationship with a set of organizations over a long period of time and being able to provide them with the resources that they need over that time? Being able to actually then take the work that those groups are doing and amplifying it to other funders and inviting other donors into those conversations and those relationships. What if it's about spending time doing that donor organizing and recognizing that as funders, we need to be in relationship, right? We have to be in funder circle like Solidaire, like Borealis, like the Donors of Color Network. We need to be in those circles so that we can continue to hold each other accountable, to up our own game, to talk about what it is that we're doing inside of our institutions. What are the silos we've got to break down? How do we actually make a grant making process that isn't onerous for organizations and doesn't just do things like, we need a proposal before we can start a conversation? We don't. We need people to sign a document that says that they've gotten the grant, contract or agreement. We don't. All of those things we can begin to shed because they're just habits. And we can build different habits around being courageous, about being trusting, about being in deep relationship. And so that's what I would say from the funder perspective. We have transformative work that we have to do too, and we can do it in community with each other and in community with our grantees.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And great preview of some of what folks will hear with the next video that we're going to show. But before we move to showing that video, we do want to do another poll to hear from folks who have joined us for this conversation. And this poll is for people who are grant seekers. So again, remember, some of you are grant makers, some of you are grant seekers, some are others. So the third that are clearly grant seekers, what is it that you need from funders? Weigh in here so that we can see what the sort of consensus is from the grant seekers who are joining us today for this webinar. And, we'll see, again, Catherine and Kitty, I think only maybe like 30–40% of folks who are on identified as grant seekers, so we don't need to get all the way to 50% before sharing the results. All right, so funding to experiment and innovate is definitely at the top, along with funding to build partnerships and solidarity. Really great insights. Other things were funding to learn and strategize with peers, funding to sustain myself through sabbaticals, and then funding to improve skills, and then other. And hopefully, it looks like we're getting some of those other responses in the chat. So I'm going to turn it back to Catherine so we can see this video about how philanthropy can support social movements. And then we'll continue with the conversation with Kris and Crystal. Thanks, Catherine.
In an ideal world, foundations would fund movement like we mean it.
What is the minimal that you need in terms of information in order to move the resources in the right direction and make the grants? Because the time that we take from field leaders to do paperwork and all that stuff to communicate with us as funders, That's time that we're robbing from the field.
We try to show our grantees we care by valuing their time and by not trying to take a bunch of their time. We don't ask for written reports, we'll do a phone call, because the phone call is a chance to build a relationship. The written report is like a time suck of 10 hours. We have found that those types of practices allow us, to the extent that we have a role in the ecosystem, add care, add the sustainability in.
We have a practice within our team that when organizations reach out to us to inquire about funding, my standard is that we actually should reply to every organization that reaches out to us, even if we can't fund them, and give them ideas about other funders they could contact or other organizations they could partner with.
I mean, so much of this has to do with trust. It has to do with the valuing of relationship over short-term outcomes, the ability to be able to navigate conflict, because there is going to be conflict when you're talking about power, when you're talking about money, when you're talking about resources.
Our intention was to try to interrupt the normally adversarial relationship, right? Where you're sitting across the table from each other, like, you know, the loan officer and the supplicant, right? And instead try to say, no, let's actually put the money on the table to demonstrate that we are trustworthy, that we can be partners. And then let's begin a conversation and a relationship.
You really have got to be able to listen. If your first thought is, well, I've been in meetings where this kind of thing happens. Someone is trying to explain to you what their strategy is, how they're going to take on very challenging issues. And your first response is to jump in and say, you can't, how are you going to do that? That's too hard. It just doesn't, immediately, that means you're not really listening to what they're saying. So first step is to listen.
A lot of times in philanthropy, we have looked for the entrepreneurial model, right? Like the great person who is the one, and if we just fund the heck out of them, they can replicate the programs everywhere in the country. Instead, it's really looking for how to support leaders in so many different ways, not expecting them to be messiahs, not saying to them, it's a marathon, but saying it's a relay. There's going to be times when you got to put the burden down and somebody else will pick it up because you are part of a network.
How can we help make leaders feel cared for, have a support network so they don't feel so lonely? We measure our impact by the connections that are made, the strengths of relationships within the fellowship network, and ongoing engagement, and people's health. Are folks feeling cared for and healthy and like they can sustain this work?
Great. So really just love the video because, we have people who are, in the grant maker position talking about what can be done. And Crystal, like a lot of what you listed is very much reflected in what we heard from your colleagues. I think the question that then comes up is like, we acknowledge and understand that foundations may be a spectrum in terms of like readiness, willingness to make these kinds of investments. What advice do you have for program officers who are trying to push the envelope in their foundation, who are trying to get their institution to implement some of these practices and start investing in ways that would be more flexible, more sustainable, more fair for movement leaders and movement building organizations?
Well, I think we, as funders, we too have to start where we are. So let me just say, it's so great to watch that video because all those people you interviewed are like people who've taught me so much. So it's just great to hear. We are learning so much from so many other foundations that are doing this work ahead of us. And I look at Dimple and General Service and all these others. We really, we're working on these things together. I think of it as being experimenting with constant acts of little courage, right? I feel like it's really important to try lots of things that make you uncomfortable every day. Because I feel like little courage is what leads to big courage. And we all imagine that it's the question of, like, how are we ever going to become the person who's, standing in front of the line, holding out against, some great tank coming down on us or whatever. We may never be that person, but we might if we continue to do small things. So I think it's really important to introduce language in general conversation, right? Be willing to talk about white supremacy. Just use the phrase to do anti-Blackness, right? Just work it into the work that you're talking about, right? With your colleagues. Begin to normalize what it feels like to hear things that make, that in the halls of most foundations may sound like, ooh, we don't go there, but be the person who goes there. And don't be shocked and just keep going with the conversation. When you bring forward proposals, bring forward things that are, in fact, general operating support grants in general. Like, just make that the way that you do your work, right? Don't feel like it has to be justified to become the policy of the whole foundation before you begin to do those kinds of things. I think beginning to try things and to begin to build that practice, one of the things we really try to do more and more is funding things for the purpose of learning how to do that kind of work, right? Put the money on the table first and learn as you go. Be in relationship in order to better understand that work. Our foundation, for example, when Jenny Agme came in and started leading our gender justice work, had not at that point in time ever funded a trans organization, right? We didn't know exactly how to begin to move from reproductive rights work to a gender justice portfolio and what that would look like for us as a foundation. But we're learning that by being in relationship with organizations that are doing that, right? And so that is actually, we don't say, let's do 10 white papers, let's find, 10 PowerPoints that are going to tell us exactly how to do it and then lay out the strategy. Let's actually find the organizations that are leading this work, give them general operating support grants, and learn as we go together.
Thanks so much. And Kris, when we did the interview with you and Desiree, one of the stories that came up from that conversation, it's in the guide, but it wasn't sort of highlighted in the video, but it was about how Arcus and other LGBT funders had really invested in collective leadership of trans-led groups as like an ecosystem. And just wanted to hear a little bit more about, like, how do you see that really being impactful? What more do you think is needed from philanthropy to really build collective leadership across organizations so that we really are building power?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I will say, I think there's so much more work to do. And I honestly could talk about this probably for like hours, but we'll try and keep it to a couple of minutes. So first off, I feel like you all did such an amazing job of just laying out everything that's needed in the guide. So I mean, ditto all of that. And I think that you will hear this many times throughout this panel, but just cannot say enough the importance of general support, unrestricted, multi-year, substantial support. Cannot say that enough. And I do want to though raise up a few key points. So the importance of, and Crystal was just speaking about this, the importance of listening to movement leaders. So, one of the things that Arcus did in 2015, and this was because they listened to trans movement leaders, is they launched a global initiative for trans movements that was based on the priorities that trans movement leaders had laid out, because they went through a whole process of gathering that information. The second thing that I just want to highlight, and Crystal was speaking to this in the earlier part of the panel, is the importance of partnership and relationship and flexibility. And I want to give a really concrete example of that. So, right now we are seeing an onslaught of anti-trans legislation across the country. Many of these bills are attacking trans youth. And what's important to know is that it's not new. These attacks started about 7 years ago. It was a very strategic and intentional attack by the conservative right on trans rights in our lives. So it's been going on for some time. And when that started, we were so clear at TLC about what trans movements needed. And we were fortunate to be in relationship and partnership with a funder who was willing to resource it from the very beginning, multi-year, unrestricted, substantial support, and that was Wellspring. And they hung with us. So what this meant is that 7 years later, 7 years later, right, we are still facing these attacks. And while we are nowhere near as positioned and as strong as we should be to fight back against them, it's so much more than we would have been if we hadn't had 7 years of support in the strategies, visions that we knew our communities needed. It means that we were able to build a national coalition of Black, Indigenous, and people of color trans leaders who just this year launched the Trans Agenda for Liberation. That took us 5 or 6 years. And that funder at no point said, you said that you were going to get this going a year ago, and it's now 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Never said that. They hung with us, they trusted in our leadership, and they understood that we needed to move at the speed of community. So trusting our leadership and resourcing it so that we can move from a place of abundance and not scarcity is so important. And to the question of what more is needed for trans movements in this time, again, could go on and on about this, but I like to reference that, in 2006 or so that's a good 15 years or so ago, I was sitting on a panel speaking to funders and asked a very similar question. And in 2021, my answer really has not changed. Resource trans organizations, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color orgs. There's no doubt that progress has been made in that time, but the reality is that even today, it's only 4 cents to every $100 that are moved to trans organizations. And yes, it's better. It used to be 3 cents, but there's just so much more to do. And at this point, trans movements and communities are incredibly innovative. So there are so many things in place to support funders to move resources to trans organizations. So if trans orgs are too small in budget size for you to support, you can move resources to the Fund for Transgeneration, to the Black Trans Fund, the Third Wave, and they can get it to the smaller organizations. If you are not sure about who the trans groups are, the Trans Justice Funding Project, also an incredible organization to support, has literally mapped out hundreds of trans organizations all across the country. All you have to do is go to their website. And if you are needing support in working with your board and working with your senior leadership to get them to support trans orgs, there's Grantmakers United for Trans Communities out of the LGBT Funders Project who is there. They have resources. They will work directly with you to work with your board or your senior leadership to figure out ways to move resources to trans orgs. And the last thing I just want to close with, I just want to highlight a few other things in terms of what trans movements are needing right now. So this was laid out in the toolkit, but the importance of funding the ecosystem. And this is gonna sound strange coming from me, but if you're only funding TLC, if you're only funding 1 or 2 trans orgs, or if you're a large funder and you're only funding a handful, we desperately need you to do more. Trans communities are facing so many attacks right now and have been for so long and for so many decades. I also know that this is a conversation amongst people who understand and believe in the importance of movement building. So I also need people to understand that for trans organizations, what movement building looks very different because of the level of attacks that our communities have faced and because of the historic under-resourcing and under-support by funders, but also broader movements for social justice, broader LGBT movements. So trans organizations are literally doing everything they possibly can to both keep our communities alive, but to also fight for rights and justice. So that means that people are providing services, people are doing mutual aid, people are doing public education, folks are finding housing and shelters, and at the same time fighting for our rights and building movements. So to know that movement building for trans orgs, it just looks different. And then the last 2 things that I'll say, and I think these don't just apply to trans orgs, is the importance of also figuring out ways to move resources to organizations who are not 501c3s or who are not fiscally sponsored. Particularly in this time, some of the most innovative and incredibly important strategies are going to come out of organizations who are not 501c3s. And then the last thing that I'll say is that, and this gets to some of the things in the toolkit and that we've shared so far, is that meaningfully sharing power with trans communities as a funder. So this can look like hiring trans folks to be on your staff, getting trans people to be on your board of directors. It can look like setting up participatory grant making, or if you already have it in place, making sure that trans leaders are part of it.
Thanks so much, Kris. And you answered some of the questions that are coming up in the chat, particularly like, thinking about, why is it that the sort of restrictiveness of traditional modes of grant making are particularly not a good match for organizations that are trying to build movements. While I don't think any of us are advocating for restrictive funding as the norm, even for organizations that maybe don't need the same level of flexibility, it is particularly a bad match for organizations that are trying to build movements, trying to organize for the long term, trying to build power and win in a very complicated and, frankly, resurgent right-wing moments, right? And so, I am curious, obviously we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions that are coming into the chat, but hopefully, we can. There was one question that came in about how should or might we think about large organizations that as a part of their strategy do a fair amount of re-granting. And can we just distinguish, because I think the re-granting that large networks do to their member organizations, there is a way in which that is a trickle-down strategy of funding. And it is also, I don't want to conflate that with some of the problems of grant making strategies that don't fit movement realities. So I'm wondering if either of you could weigh in on how we might think about that as distinct, and still not pretend that there aren't complications or problems with the trickle-down strategy. I don't know, Kris or Crystal, if either of you has a take on that.
I was going to say, Crystal, if you want to kick it off.
Well, I will say that for the Libra Foundation, funding re-granting organizations is a critical part of our strategy. As Kris was saying earlier, we really do believe that there are some movement accountable re-granting entities that folks that are doing frontline movement work will name as being people who have helped them to get going, right? So as Kris was saying, maybe those organizations are able to move pots of money to individuals who don't yet have, a 501c3. They might be able to be moving money to young people who are really just organizing kind of because they're organizers, but don't necessarily, maybe they just need a small salary, or they're, I've seen some big organizations that are, moving money to people or bringing on a consultant who's doing organizing because they know that consultant needs some health insurance, right? Like there's all kinds of creative ways that those groups, now that's not to say that that's the exact same thing as some very large national organizations that suck up all the money and maybe don't really disperse that money out to frontline organizations in the ways that they perhaps might claim that they do. And so I think there are distinctions. It needs to be a community accountable. But I do think that re-granting is something that there are some organizations, you had, Vanessa Daniel and Groundswell, that we certainly partner with deeply. And then there are also organizations like, Democracy Frontlines Fund. We work with Highlander Center. Well, Highlander doesn't claim to be a regranter, but they are. They actually do quite a bit of incubating of new organizations. They regrant to smaller organizations. So I think that that is a natural part of many movement organizations, and one that as funders, we should be supportive of, because it really is how we build a vibrant ecosystem, because we can't fund and know all of those smaller organizations, but we want to make sure resources are getting there too.
Thanks so much, Crystal. Kris, what were you going to add?
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly. So yes to everything that Crystal just shared, and and I absolutely think that getting resources to groups who are doing regranting is so critical. And I just can't underline the importance enough of resourcing the groups directly. Like sometimes I worry that then becomes a way to not resource the groups directly. So it's a both and, right? The regranting is important, and resourcing the groups directly is as important as well.
Thanks. And we just got another question about like the elephant in the room being capitalism. And how do we have more authentic conversations? Crystal, you said like people should actually be using the words anti-Blackness. They should be having critical conversations about white supremacy, white dominant culture, and I think probably capitalism as well, since that's how the resources were, consolidated and then now are being redistributed. Crystal, what kind of conversations are you seeing happen in philanthropy to sort of grapple with the complications of capitalism as the system that we're kind of saddled with right now?
Yeah, I think there are conversations that are really important that need to happen. And, let's be honest, this is a little bit of the third rail in philanthropy, right? It's sort of a very difficult topic to bring up, and an important one, right? To say the words, to name it as an issue. Because I work in family philanthropy, I think that one of the things that we talk a lot about, we try and use I phrases a lot at the board level, and we try and talk through how people experience this. And one of the things we're really seeing is that younger generations of folks who have inherited wealth want to have a different conversation. They're not necessarily people who believe that it is personally in their interest or actually true in their experience that capitalism is all about bootstrap, and everybody who's trying hard and working hard gets what they deserve. And so there's a willingness, I think, on the part of many of younger generations of wealth to enter into a conversation that's different about what capitalism is, who it's working for, how it operates. I think we also are seeing that new forms of conversations about ownership, as we have conversations and truthful discussions about land, about what it means to be in business. We're seeing lots of new models coming up. I look at my colleagues over at the Katali Foundation, Amaka Agbo, who's really leading this conversation about, employee ownership, community land trusts, and how do we own land in ways that actually reflects our values around the us and not the I. I think those are ways that we're beginning to enter into some of these conversations about what's working in capitalism, what's not, what needs to, what the ways in which extractive habits are the things that are killing us all, whether the work that you do is in, finance, whether the work that you do is in environment, that those are all things that are problematic. So I think those conversations are beginning to happen, not as much as most of us would like, but again, got to talk about it, got to raise it. And I think we are beginning to see some movement around it.
Well, thanks so much. Please, everybody, join me in thanking both Crystal and Kris for joining us. I am gonna turn it back to Deepa to talk a little bit more about how to sort of stay connected to this work and how to reach out to us. But I just want to, again, really reiterate the appreciation to Crystal and Kris for this conversation, but also acknowledge that they were a part of these dialogues that happened and were recorded months ago that led to the development of the video. In addition, we had a group of funders who participated in a learning lab for several months. And, we just are really happy that this has been an ongoing project over the last several months that seems to be gaining momentum. And we really hope that this is going to be an opportunity to support and also push grant makers to move the money to movement building organizations. And so Kris and Crystal, thanks again for your leadership and for sharing your insights and wisdom. And Deepa, I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of close things out in terms of how people can stay connected to this body of work and the resources that we've created.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Kris. And before you all drop off, I know you want to just stay with me for 1 second to our audience. So as we close out, we talked about a lot of these practices that are on your screen right now that show up in the guides and videos, and the importance of supporting social movements right now through leaders, as the chair embodies, through infrastructure and through ecosystem support. But none of this, right, can happen without changing philanthropic culture, influencing peers and reshuffling the power dynamics, and dealing with the culture of extraction and the importance of redistribution of wealth. You'll find a lot of that content in the guides and videos that we did not show today. So I hope you will check those out. And I really want to go back to something Crystal said. The little acts of courage are so important because they can lead to transformational change. And so as we look at this last slide of how you could practice those little acts of courage, and I know that folks are doing that in their movement organizations as well as their philanthropic organizations every single day, we hope that Move the Money can contribute to the ongoing work that you're doing. So how can you do this? Please set up discussion groups at your foundation or your movement organization that use these reflection guides where you show the video and engage in a conversation with staff. Bring us in for a discussion or presentation so that we can say some things perhaps that you can't say, and that we can provide and present some of this information. Share with your peers and networks using Move the Money, and stay tuned. This is not done yet, right? For us, this is not a one-off kind of launch that we're doing. We are going to share clips of the paired dialogues that BMP interviewed folks for in the coming months. So you can see movement leaders in conversation with funders directly. We are also going to do a deeper dive seminar series starting in January of 2022 on this material. So as I showed you on the webpage, we have a place where you can submit a request to connect with us. We really hope we'll get lots of those in the next hour or so, and hope that you'll stay connected with us in that way. So with that, I think we can stop the screen share. Hope we can bring everyone on if you're still with us, Kris, Crystal, Sean, and want to thank you all for being part of this project. I want to thank everyone who is here. And if you have ideas and recommendations on what we could do more with these resources, please reach out to us, and we will be in touch and look forward to moving the money with you to support movement organizations and movement leaders in this time and into the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody.